Welcome back to ABC 13 Weather Now. I'm joined by Houston Chronicle meteorologist Justin Ballard, our regular Monday friend here, to discuss how weather modification in relation to hurricanes is simply impossible with today's technology. Thanks for being here, Justin.
Thanks for having me. Of course, a lot of topic in the weather circles over the last couple of weeks on this.
Yeah, and a lot of people are naturally curious, and they're seeing some things on the social networks. They want to know what's going on here, what's the truth. So for today's segment, we're talking about recent theories and speculation that have been circulating around on those social platforms about one being able to create and control hurricanes, steer them where they go, which is simply not true. Now, you're actually working on an op-ed for the Houston Chronicle focusing on this topic. What was your motivation behind writing this in the first place?
I think one of the first pieces of motivation that I kind of found was the post that kind of went viral that you did a week or two ago during Milton, or leading up to Milton. You know, a lot of these theories kind of started bubbling up to the surface. Obviously, we've seen them for years now when we're talking about chemtrails and things of that nature. So we're not necessarily new to this, but it has certainly hit a pitch where a lot of people were asking me, hey, what's going on? So that's what inspired it.
Right, and when people ask, we're gonna give you the scientific truth and the answer. So there's a lot of conflation with different types of weather modification. One particular one in particular is cloud seeding. So let's explain to our viewers what cloud seeding is, and talk a little bit about the government's attempts to experiment with cloud seeding hurricanes in the past.
Because we have, right, as a society, seen some attempts at cloud seeding and some weather modification, we'll call it.
Sure.
And you can do that on a small scale, but you can't do that. You can't do that out of thin air, and you can't do that with something as large scale as a hurricane, which is literally hundreds of miles, except for maybe Oscar.
Right. So yeah, Oscar's a very tiny hurricane. So I gave a talk last week to a group of Aggies here in town, and I talked about scale. Right. So I'm holding a candle in my hand. I can blow it out. Does that mean that I can then go out and blow out a wildfire?
No.
No, it does not. Scale, right? Two different things, right? When we're talking about cloud seeding, we're talking about seeding a very small cloud. But they did experiment with doing some hurricanes. It was called Project Storm Fury. Tell us a little bit more about Project Storm Fury.
This was a little bit more than a 20-year kind of project from NOAA. The hurricane cloud seeding, you see them there. Ginger, Beulah, Debbie, which is a similar name. We were familiar with Debbie here in 2024. And then Esther was kind of the first hurricane. So 4 hurricanes were attempted to be cloud seeding and were cloud seeded, but the results were not great.
They were inconclusive, right?
Inconclusive,
so they saw a weakening in some of the storms, but what they didn't understand was exactly how hurricanes worked.
Right.
So there's this process called an eye wall replacement cycle,
which a lot of us are probably familiar with
nowadays, right? Yeah. But it has the same effect as what they observed.
But in the early 60s, late 70s, you know, that was just not something that you necessarily heard of or understood. So basically the concept, if we want to get into a little bit of the weeds, you know, we were trying to inject silver iodine, and when I say we, I don't mean me or you specifically.
You're not flying that plane.
Absolutely not. But they were trying to inject silver iodine outside of the eye wall. Obviously, the eye wall is where kind of the worst of the stormy weather is.
So these are like outer rain bands of the storm.
Exactly. So they were trying to kind of broaden out that wind field just a little bit, and that was going to hopefully weaken it. Right. And there were some 10 to 15% reduction points of like overall top wind speeds. The problem with that is obviously, and you know this, you know, kind of bring out the winds a little bit more, and you're impacting more people with potentially hurricane force winds.
So eventually they abandoned that project. They realized it wasn't feasible, wasn't practical, didn't really work.
Problem,
but another thing I've heard about is something called Project Cirrus. So we have a map showing the storm that was seeded. This was the original cloud seeding experiment of a hurricane. In 1947, they dropped 180 pounds of dry ice in an outer rain band. That's like a few ice chests. A few ice chests of dry ice. But here's the thing. They dropped it right at that inflection point when it got east of Florida, and then the next day they flew back out there. Remember, this is before there were satellites, before we had computer models, before we could really predict where they were going. It turned westward unexpectedly to them and intensified. And the scientists behind this thought, oh my God, what have we done? We dropped 180 pounds of dry ice and steered this storm into Georgia. Of course, now we laugh at that because, again, scale, right? Yeah. I mean, that really has no impact whatsoever.
I mean, the amount of dry ice or the amount of silver iodine it would take, I can't even fathom how much
Massive
it would maybe
quantities,
take to make just a small difference.
So then, what about lasers? So there was a report that's been circulating around from 2013 speculating about using lasers to control the weather. I actually tracked down one of the researchers who did that work, Dr. Ali Miri with the City University of New York, and he told me, quote, the scientific research paper that I contributed to many years ago was about extending the length of an optical filament to about a few meters, if I recall correctly. The media took it and exaggerated on potential use of optical filaments for controlling weather. I'm not aware of any institutes currently using high-power lasers for such an application, end quote. He also mentioned this is not his area of expertise, nor is it his current research focus, so I did some digging elsewhere and found a recent research paper published in January of 2023 that details how high-powered lasers were successfully used to guide a lightning bolt for about 165 feet. So when it comes to lasers, that's about all we can do right now is attempt to guide a lightning bolt.
Which is still impressive.
It's incredible.
But, I mean, you still can't manipulate weather on a large scale, certainly.
Right. So much power from those
Even with
hurricanes.
lasers.
So your op-ed is not published yet.
Not published
but it's
yet.
coming out soon. And in some ways it's personal to you because you grew up in the Carolinas.
I did, yes. And so obviously all of these kind of theories, conspiracy theories, have kind of come a little bit more mainstream. And we've seen in a couple of instances, they're kind of hampering relief efforts. They're distracting from the main message that these folks need help. They don't need distractions.
And what we need to is just give people the honest truth of what we can and cannot do when it comes to modifying the weather. Justin Ballard, thanks so much for joining us today.